Today, we are discussing the topic of bias and its impact on your internal workplace investigations. We are going to take you through the topic of both bias and unconscious bias, help you to identify those both in yourself and in the conduct of your investigations. And then finally, we are going to allow some time for questions and answers at the end of today's presentation. My name is Dorian Persaud. I am the senior lawyer at Persaud Employment Law. We are a team of employment lawyers who specialize in conducting investigations and helping you to build healthy workplaces through investigations, training, and proactive advice. When you receive a complaint of misconduct, one of the things that you do at the outset is to vet that complaint. And what you're trying to do is put together a fair process to help you get at the truth of what occurred. And putting together that process, you want to be mindful of the principles of fundamental justice. And there are, three factors here that I want to bring to your attention in terms of guiding that process. Number one is the investigator or the decision maker, is that person neutral? Can they follow the evidence and arrive at the conclusion, whatever that might be? Secondly, you want to make sure that the parties to an investigation, that they have some notice in terms of what's going to unfold. Is it a predictable process? Have they been given notice of the allegations that have been made, and are they aware then of what are the steps that are about to unfold? That's important. And then finally, have the parties been given an opportunity to be heard? And that applies both to the complainant in terms of an opportunity to tell his or her story. Here are the things that I experienced that I found problematic. And then similarly, with the responding party, are they given an opportunity to sit down with the decision maker and fully explain their side of the story for these allegations that have been made? In terms of your duty as an employer, you want to make sure that you conduct a timely and a fair investigation. So from the time that you receive that complaint, you want to vet that complaint to see if there is a potential policy violation, and then take steps to put that process in place. The parties, to that process should know, here are the steps that are going to unfold, and then at the end of it, they should be made aware of the outcomes. Right, here is the investigation we went through, and this is what we found. And so certainly those findings should be communicated to the parties. One of the areas where employers sometimes fall down is there isn't a clear mechanism in terms of, here are the steps you go through to file a complaint, or related policies and procedures in terms of letting them know, here's the process that we are going to follow. And it's not to say that information doesn't exist, but sometimes it's either not easily accessible in a policy, or sometimes based on the size of the organization, folks might have some confusion. So let me give you an example of that. It's you might be operating a medium-sized business, but the person who's in charge of HR is related to the owner of the company. So you've got a policy that says, look, you've got a problem, bring it to HR's attention, we'll investigate it. To the extent that there's some relationship there, and I'm thinking of folks who are related as opposed to just friendly with each other, that might cause some confusion as far as within the workforce. Is HR neutral, and can I actually bring this forward? So these are some of the things that you want to be mindful of. I've seen this in other contexts too, with a in a university and college setting where some folks, students might not be aware that, look, here's the process I can follow to bring a complaint forward. How safe is that process? Am I going to suffer a reprisal for having brought this forward? So there's some practical concerns out there, again, that you want to make sure that you are alert to, and that you can then address that in your specific workplace policies. In terms of bias, let's start by identifying, what is it? And in the investigation context, we can think of bias as essentially a prejudgment that's not fair to the parties. And that bias might be seen then in terms of how evidence is collected and maybe the weight that you give to certain evidence, and then certainly the conclusions that are reached. And let me give you the example of Boucher and Walmart. And Ms. Boucher, worked in a Walmart retail location, and she suffered horribly at the hands of her supervisor. And this individual, yelled at her and berated her. And when she brought her complaints forward to HR, this manager was so incensed that he wanted to humiliate her. So he would actually make sure that he was, doing these things in front of other employees in order to further humiliate Ms. Boucher. Walmart investigated the complaint that was brought forward by this employee. But this case, travels the road, and as it gets to trial, it's actually unclear in terms of the judge's finding. It's unclear if Walmart actually meets with any of these witnesses to this abusive conduct. And Walmart, after conducting this internal investigation, concludes that, well, these allegations are unfounded. There's not enough evidence here to find that these things Ms. Boucher complained of actually occurred. Again, at trial, there are a number of witnesses who spoke to what occurred. And so that was one of the question marks that the court had, was how is it that you're not able to establish whether or not you met with these individuals? And to the extent that you did, how is it that you arrive at a conclusion that these things are unfounded when clearly there's enough evidence to support that they occurred? So that's an example of bias at play, where you conduct an investigation and you have a certain outcome that you want to achieve in mind, and that influences who you meet with and whether or not you meet with certain folks, and then the weight that you give to certain evidence to essentially engineer the result that you are looking for. Now, we all have to understand that we all are biased in a certain way, right? Like, we bring our own experiences, we have our own education and religious beliefs and values that inform who we are and how we navigate this world. So all of us have a certain, what I like to call a certain bent, and that helps us, make decisions as we navigate this life. When it comes to an investigation, though, you want to make sure that you're aware of the way that you lean on a particular issue, or with respect to the subject matter or the folks that you might be interacting with during an investigation, so that you can check that bias and make sure it isn't influencing your investigation in a negative way. When it comes to challenging an investigation because of bias, the plaintiff in that case doesn't have to show actual bias. It's whether or not the individual maintained an open mind, and whether or not the investigator has predetermined the issue. So if we go back to the Boucher and Walmart decision, that's a good example where, based on the evidence, you can see that clearly that team of investigators that looked into Ms. Boucher's complaint certainly could not demonstrate an open mind, certainly couldn't demonstrate a neutral and a fair approach if they didn't meet with relevant witnesses. And keep in mind that these witnesses were readily available. These aren't folks who had, witnessed the event, but this thing happened a long time ago, and or they had moved on to another organization. No, these were folks who were still present in the workplace and accessible to Walmart. So that's an issue where, as you point out these missteps and flaws with the investigation, it then raises the question as far as whether or not the folks conducting the investigation actually had an open mind or demonstrated bias. If we take a step back from bias, another thing that you want to keep in mind and be alert to is just even the reasonable apprehension of bias, right? So do the parties to the investigation feel as though they're getting a fair shake? There's a case involving Bell Mobility and an employee by the name of Marta Perez Ferreira, where the employee brings forward a complaint of harassment and assault in the workplace. The company has an HR manager conduct the investigation. As it turns out, he has worked for decades with the respondent in the responding party to the complaint. So you have these folks who've known each other for a long time in the workplace, and there's evidence that they spent time together and socialized outside of the workplace. And it wasn't to say that this HR manager was biased in terms of doing his job and conducting his investigation into the complaint. However, the judge pointed out that there are important rights at stake during a workplace investigation. Depending on the severity of the allegations and the findings, someone could lose their job. And in that context, based on what's at stake, certainly companies should be mindful of not just implementing a fair process, but making sure that you're implementing a process that's free of even the apprehension of bias. So for a big company like Bell Mobility, they certainly had a number of other people that they could have chosen to conduct the investigation. If you don't have those resources internally, certainly you can bring in an external investigator to look into the complaint. And those were steps that the court identified and indicated Bell Mobility should have considered in the circumstances. So what are some examples? What does bias actually look like as we are going about this work? Well, one example is just the unequal treatment of the complainant and the respondent. If we go back to the Bell Mobility and Perez Ferreira example, Bell Mobility took the written complaint that they received and didn't feel the need to meet with Ms. Perez Ferreira to better understand her complaint. They assumed it was very comprehensive and it was clear, and they had enough to go with, and they could just run off and then start interviewing other witnesses. And they went up and they interviewed the respondent and conducted their investigation and concluded their investigation without ever having involved the complainant. You want to make sure that you're not doing that. That you want to make sure that you are at the front end, not assuming that you know everything, but actually sitting down and with the complainant and making sure that you've heard his or her story. And in my experience, it is not uncommon that despite receiving something that's very clearly written, there's more flavor that's added to it, or there might be other allegations, but certainly more detail that you receive at that initial meeting that helps you better understand not just the complaint, but the dynamics between the parties. And that helps you then as you decide how you're going to set up your investigation and how you are going to approach those interviews with the responding party or with other witnesses. Another example of bias is, not being even-handed, and whether that's not meeting with relevant witnesses or not really putting weight on certain evidence that has been provided to you. Again, you want to make sure that you are considering all of the information that's presented to you, that you are asking for that information. You're not simply relying on the fact that, hey, this person provided me with this, and they were proactive and they organized it nicely for me and packaged it nicely, and I'm just going to run with that and not do the heavy lifting of maybe working with a complainant or a responding party who might not be as sophisticated and who might need a little bit of prompting or need a reminder. You want to make sure that turned over all those stones, that you have made strong efforts to ask about what information exists and what might be accessible beyond just the information that has been presented to you. And we've got the obvious example of bias where the parties know each other, and that familiarity can affect one's objectivity. So there are a number of ways that bias can present itself, but here these are some useful examples that you can look to and try to avoid as you do this work going forward. We mentioned that bias is both conscious and unconscious, right? And unconscious bias, by definition, how do we identify something that is difficult for us to articulate? And it starts with that recognition that we all come to this work with certain experiences, with our education, with our value systems. And it's important for us to recognize that and look at how those things might impact our work. So, for example, let's just say, you had a romantic partner and that partner, that spouse, cheated on you, and that was a hurtful experience. And now you find yourself, conducting this sexual harassment investigation, and the complainant is having an open affair with the responding party, who is a married man, and there are complications with that relationship, and there's some credibility issues in terms of the evidence that you've received from these parties. To what extent does your own experience or your own value system, in terms of someone who values keeping promises and being faithful, to what extent does any of that influence your approach or your thinking and reasoning when you are conducting these interviews? And then when it comes time to make a credibility assessment, to what extent are you judging these individuals, and how is that potentially influencing the way that you determine credibility in this case? So you can see that there's many layers to these issues. They're not oftentimes easy to identify or to unpack, and the answers aren't at all clear. But the process of identifying this potential bias and wrestling with it is what is important in terms of doing this work and making sure that you are being honest with yourself and then doing an honest job for the parties. Unconscious bias can also be reflected in terms of the expectations that we have of others. So in terms of how people behave, we might have this image of a nice old lady, and this is their disposition and the way that we expect them to be. So maybe we have some doubts when we hear that this nice old lady whacked a nurse over the head with her cane in a nursing home, or this nice elderly person is acting in a way that is harassing or bullying someone else in the workplace. We just have sometimes a hard time, grappling with those preconceived notions that we have of individuals. A similar example is when it comes to, folks who are going through trauma and how do we expect them to behave in that circumstance? Well, if they are describing this thing that is so awful, and here's how they were treated, or here's how they were threatened, and here's how they were blackmailed, but they're not really crying about this, and they don't really seem that concerned, doesn't seem that heartfelt, their evidence doesn't seem that heartfelt, do we rely on that as a basis to find that these things did or did not happen, right? So those are some of the things that some of the ways that we can approach and begin to understand unconscious bias during the investigation process. it's not unusual to like people who are similar to us. And again, to what extent does that ability to form a fast relationship or more of a connection with someone, does that influence the way that we might see an issue? And you know, and in terms of examples of how this comes into affecting the investigation is you then start to look for information that really confirms your preconceptions of an individual, and again, you almost begin to curate the conclusion that you're looking for. Keep in mind as well that bias exists at an organizational level. So, in as much as we're focused on as an individual and as an investigator, how do I identify bias and unconscious bias, that these same issues exist at a organizational or at a systemic level. So that could be entire HR departments or management groups who share a certain bias or a certain view, and that will then be manifested in the workplace. And there's a lot of allegations out there of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies not being implemented or being implemented inconsistently, and a lot of frustration between different groups who may want to interview a certain candidate or maybe offer a job to a certain candidate, and you've got other groups that are battling against whether it's inviting folks for an interview or extending an offer to folks. So we're seeing these issues play out at that macro level, and so it's something again for you to be alert to. As an investigator, what you want to do is make sure that you can approach your work in an honest way. So you are able to listen to the parties. You are going to be guided by the evidence and allow the evidence to lead you to a finding, whatever that finding might be. You might be upsetting one of the parties, or you might be upsetting a key member of the management team because of the finding that you're about to make and the implications of that. So in doing this work, you need to be honest. You also need to have a measure of courage as well to say, to not be afraid to arrive at those conclusions and to ultimately to stand by them if and when challenged. I wanted to review a few cases with you before we move to the question and answer portion. One of them is Lee and Magna International. And this was a case where a coworker came forward to HR and said that this employee, Lee, had harassed him and he was filing a complaint. And the HR manager, before she could investigate that complaint, she actually had her own run-in with Lee. And it was on an unrelated issue. And it was her evidence that, her interaction with Lee during this meeting, that he was, so loud and so aggressive that she, quote unquote, feared for her life. Like that was the intensity of the interaction. That was her description of it at the hearing. Notwithstanding that, she still proceeded to investigate this harassment complaint that had been brought forward against Lee by this other employee. And Lee took issue with this, and he said, look, you're biased based on this dispute that I recently had with you, that you are, or you should be conflicted out from handling this complaint. And the HR manager disagreed. And one of the things that came out of this case was that she didn't really have a strong understanding of what a conflict of interest was and the reasons why this previous interaction could cloud her judgment and her ability to approach this investigation in an impartial manner. So certainly the issue of bias, as we saw from the Bell Mobility and Paris Ferreira case, that these are similar themes that come forward as far as needing to put together a process that's not just free of bias, but just free from the appearance of bias. And in this case, the the Ontario Labour Relations Board found that looked at the manager just based on her own personal interaction with this complainant and potentially her own complaint against him for his behavior, should have identified that that there was a conflict here and should have moved to have someone else do the investigation or an external person. Another example is that of Elgert and Home Hardware. And this is a case of sexual harassment where you have the employee Elgert accused of sexual harassment, and Home Hardware appointed an internal investigator to look into this issue. This individual had never conducted a sexual harassment investigation in his life. And for those of us who have done these investigations, know that you need to approach them in a different way than you would a run-of-the-mill conflict of interest investigation. And so this person just didn't really appreciate the nuances to a sexual harassment investigation. But then even more problematic when it came to setting up the investigation and meeting with the responding party, there was a prejudgment of his guilt, and to the point where the responding party wasn't even given any details about the allegations that had been made against him. They simply sat him down in a room without any notice as far as what the meeting was about, and then proceeded to tell him, well, you know why you're here and you know what you did. And this employee was totally confused. He had no idea what they were talking about. He was asking them to actually conduct a proper investigation and to get to the bottom of it, because in his view, he's being falsely accused of he doesn't know what. And that's an example of just the company getting it wrong and not appointing a competent investigator, ignoring all the red flags. The investigator worked for decades with the complainant's father in this case, so there's that family tie-in. There are a host of issues and missteps with this investigation, but it serves as a good example for us in terms of what not to do, but also how easy it is to make these mistakes. Right, out of convenience, we want to respond right away, and we think we've got someone experienced who can handle the situation, but when things go wrong, it ends up creating a bigger issue than what we were initially dealing with. It gets even more expensive, and then you've got the additional damage to reputation when these cases are reported and others see what happened here. So you want to make sure that from a reputational standpoint and just a liability standpoint, that you're doing the best that you can to get these things right and to avoid unnecessary harm. When an investigation goes off the rails and when you don't respond to harassment complaints in the right way, there are serious consequences, right? So you can have let's just say in the unionized context, you have dismissed or you have disciplined someone based on what's occurred. Well, you get the investigation wrong, then and you've done that in a biased way, then that decision gets overturned at arbitration, and you're looking at paying back wages to the employee, or maybe you are facing reinstatement of that individual. In the case of Ms. Boucher and Walmart, she was awarded $200,000 in extraordinary damages, in part because of the flawed investigation that Walmart conducted and the consequent harm that inflicted on Ms. Boucher. So you want to make sure that, again, you identify this issue of bias, you're alert to issues of unconscious bias, and you're making sure that that this issue isn't derailing your workplace investigations. So in terms of some steps that you can take going forward, you want to go through that checklist we provided and identify bias at the outset of the investigation. It's helpful to involve others in your deliberation. So if you've got some questions about the investigation itself, or whether or not certain facts or certain individuals are presenting an issue of bias, you can talk that out with others at work, or even external to the organization, to really get at the heart of that issue and make sure in wrestling with these concerns, that you're resolving them in a way that's going to stand up to scrutiny. If in doubt, you can always use a neutral third party to assist with the investigation. And then finally, again, you want to make sure that you are implementing a fair process to get to the truth of what happened, and you're allowing yourself to be led by the evidence, whatever that outcome might be. So I'd like to open it up now for questions, and you can use the Q&A function, and please do direct your question there, and we'll take each of them in turn. The one question that's come forward is, it'd be great to discuss what would have been the right steps to take in the specific examples and some of the best practices. So in terms of the, what would have been the right steps to take, if we look at the, say the home hardware decision, right? You've got an internal investigator who A, has not conducted a sexual harassment investigation before, B, has worked for decades with the complainant's father, who is a senior manager at Home Hardware. So right from the get-go, Home Hardware would have been better served by acknowledging that, look, leaving aside the investigator's experience, look, just by virtue of this investigator working for decades with the complainant's dad, let's not use this individual. Let's find someone who understands and who has actually conducted a sexual harassment investigation, and in that way, we can have more confidence, both as a company and then also from the perspective of the parties, we'll have more confidence that this is going to be done the right way. And it's not to say that if you do those things, that you end up with a perfect investigation, or that you end up at an accurate conclusion in terms of what happened. However, from a process standpoint, right? From a process standpoint, it puts you in the driver's seat. Like, you are able to then say, we found a competent investigator. We don't have someone who's got a friendly relationship with either of the parties. So this is truly, a neutral individual, internally, who can look into these complaints. And if you can't find someone who you can look at with some confidence to say, you can't find someone who doesn't have that close relationship, or you can't find someone who's got that skill set, it's really easy to pull a competent investigator in and have that person do that work. So I would say in the Home Hardware case, that's a clear, here are the things that the company could have done to avoid that bias. In the Boucher and Walmart decision, that's simply one where the organization, I don't know to what extent others in HR vet the work of the investigation team, right? Because if you then get this investigation report back and that report says these allegations are unfounded, one of the first questions I would have is, why are they unfounded? So who did you meet with? Right? Who did you ask the complainant or the respondent whether or not there were witnesses to this event? Did you get those individuals' names and their contact information? Yes. Okay. Did you meet with those individuals? Okay. Where's the evidence in terms of what those individuals said when you met with them? And these, this investigative team should be taking notes of their interviews. You should be able, if you're conducting that oversight role, you should be able to see what occurred at all of these interviews and what was said. And you can identify whether or not the right questions were asked, and whether you then need to go back to these witnesses to fill in the gaps in that evidence. But that would have been, from an internal perspective, that would have been the step that HR should have taken, is figure out why is it that you've got these serious complaints and you're finding that all of these allegations are unfounded. That in and of itself should raise red flags and result in a deeper review. So that's, do you want to get to some other questions? But Ada, just to answer your question, I hope that gives you an indication of some steps that the companies could have taken in the cases that we reviewed. Questions come in as another question that's come in asks, have you found bias when evaluating actual employee policies or a handbook? That's an interesting question, because the handbook or the policy itself can outline steps that are fair and on its face seems to be a neutral and a coherent process and a procedure that folks should follow. It's really in the implementation of that, right? So if you take a harassment complaint and you say, look, you've got a complaint that when you have a concern, here's who you report that concern to, and here is the process that the organization is going to follow, and they'll map out some sort of a investigation / fact-finding process. It isn't clear in terms of those steps. There's nothing that indicates bias necessarily at any of those steps, but it's the implementation of it, right? So you then, as the internal HR person following through on this policy, are you doing your work honestly? Do you have a negative animus towards one party? Let's just say you've got a frequent flyer, right? Like many of us are familiar with these folks who, no matter what happens, they're just they seem to come forward every year or every so often, and they've got concerns about their manager, and so this is like the third or fourth or fifth investigation that you're doing because of this individual. When they come forward the sixth time, how much patience do you have for their complaint? But that doesn't mean that just because they've come forward 5 times and their concerns aren't founded, and there's a level of exhaustion with this person, that doesn't mean that the sixth complaint isn't legitimate, right? And I think there's a sense of exhaustion that we can get to internally when dealing with these folks, and you then just don't follow the policies and the procedures in the same way. And so it's not the policy that's flawed. It's just we're suffering from that burnout and just that negative animus towards this individual who seems to be abusing the policy, and we just don't have the time and don't want to make the time for this individual, and then that leads to us maybe not following the policy, or just not giving that individual the fairness and the time that we might give somebody else. Is there any advice on how to have a conversation with upper management about bringing in a third party if you identify bias? I think the best way to approach this is by pointing out the potential liability here. And this seems to be an issue that we see cropping up very frequently in the cases where folks come forward and the reported decisions where there are issues raised. Oftentimes it's there's bias or the appearance of bias in the investigation that's been conducted internally. So one of the ways that will catch management's attention is to say, look, we have the case of Magna where they made this mistake. We have a case of Boucher and Walmart where they made this mistake. We've got Bell Mobility and Pieris Ferreira where they made this mistake. And look at how much it costs these companies. When you make this mistake and you don't dedicate the resources to bringing in a neutral third party, and we've already identified this issue of bias internally, and this is why we believe a third party investigation is warranted. If you don't make that investment, here are the potential outcomes if and when things fall off the rails. And I think that would be a good starting point, because you're going to get the attention of management when they see the potential liability here that's attached to it. Because oftentimes they look at it, from a resource perspective, and certainly it's not inexpensive to bring in a third party. But the expense of the investigation pales in comparison to the cost of getting it wrong. and you get it wrong, and then you've got a constructive dismissal lawsuit or a discrimination case, or whatever the situation might be, and then you've got aggravated or punitive damages that the individual is claiming, and the whole thing gets very expensive and very messy very quickly. So painting that picture for senior management, I think, will help you get to that next step of helping them then understand, why this is important, and what are the options here in terms of a third-party investigator and the scope of that investigation. Another question is, if as a small business, I have a manager who expresses bias towards an employee who may be under investigation, what do you find is the best way to advocate for your own objectivity towards the case? It's a great question, because in HR, you're straddling both worlds, right? You are, interacting with management, and in this case, you're on the front lines of receiving these complaints and investigating this particular complaint. So you've got to be, just by virtue of your role, you're available and you're a resource to all sides in this conflict. I think if there's an active investigation going on, you can simply let the individual know that, to say, because of this investigation that's going on, and as you know, I'm the one conducting the investigation, I would, it'd be helpful if you didn't, share those views. I'm trying to, conduct this work in a way that's fair to all parties, so that, at the end of the day, we've got a conclusion and a report that's going to stand up to scrutiny. So you might just want to, point that out, that, while, outside of this investigation, happy for you to have these candid conversations with you, but while this investigation's ongoing, just, I need to, take a step back a little bit and remove myself, from that casual shop talk. I think that might be one way to approach it. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't really control, what's being said to you. What you can control is just the way that you approach your work, and how you arrive at your conclusions. And, you don't want to be swayed, by how, others might see the complainant. What you want to be swayed by is the evidence, right? So you want to go about your work and make sure that at the end of the process, whether it's the complainant, the respondent, or your senior managers who are asking you the tough questions about how did you arrive at this conclusion, at the end of the day, you want to be able to give a strong answer to that. So I think, Thomas, that's where I would keep my focus is, let's, as best we can, try to be guided by the evidence. Okay. Well, those are all the questions that I saw come through. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send. You can send me an email, and you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always on there, and happy to connect with you. Please scan this link and be happy to, if you found today's session beneficial, happy to receive a positive review from you. And like I said, please do scan the link. And if you're looking for a copy of this presentation, or you've got questions that you want answered, please do connect with me, and I'll be happy to answer those questions for you. But thank you again for your participation this afternoon. Appreciate your time and your engagement, and you'll be receiving an invite for our upcoming webinars, and I look forward to seeing you at future events. Thanks very much. Take care, everyone.